Would you like to chant something? Okay. So we'll begin with chanting of the Maha Mantra, which is, according to the Kali Santarana Upanishad, a mantra which is meant to deliver one, especially in this age of Kali Yuga, and Sarva Vedeshu Drishyate, that one who can see the purpose of the Vedas, who has searched through all the Vedas, can see that they're pointing to this Maha Mantra as the essence, because there's no difference between the mantra and Krishna himself. And the purpose of the Vedas is to understand Krishna. Sarvasya chaham hridisani vishto matak smritir jnanam apohanam cha Vedaishcha sarver ahameva vedyo vedanta kridveda vedeva chaham. 2 maximum. Can you do kartals? Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Preshtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine Namo Vishnu Padaya Veshtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Nitina Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Is that tuned? Is it tuned? Okay. Okay. Tara Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Hare, Rama Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Krishna, Krishna Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Hare, Rama Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Nitai Gaura Haribol, 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 Nitai Gaura Haribol, Haribol, Jaya Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Jaya Prabhupada. Go Premanande! Priya Kishore harmonium. Come on, a little more. That's it for the kartal players. Adwait on Madunga. For the Hare Krishna singers. Go Premanande! Nitai Gaura Haribol, 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 Nitai Gaura Haribol. Om Jnanaatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Tadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Sri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Sri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Sadvadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Sri Vishakhan Vitamscha. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute. Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye. Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya evacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Brinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Gopremanande Hari Hari Bo. So the human life is an opportunity to become perfected in one's perception, discipline, and contentment. That means perception, if you'll work with me on this. Perception. Maguna. Thank you. Perception, discipline, and contentment. Perception, discipline, contentment. Perception, discipline, contentment. So if anybody asks you after the class, what was that guy talking about there? You can say, we're learning how to come to higher levels of perception, discipline, and contentment. So this word perception, it actually, pre means all, and a Latin word which means to take. It means what we take from our environment, from the circumstance that we're in life. Preceptere means we grab certain things, we leave other things behind. This is our perception. One person's perception is different from another's because they've gone through a different course of life and they've attained a different modality in life. As Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Purusha prakritisto hi bhunkti prakriti jangunan karanam guna sangosya sarasad yoni janmasu. That the way that one associates with various modes of nature in this world will determine the outcome of his or her life in various places in various species. And the process of yoga means to practice in such a way that one's perception is such that one sees the opportunity within every circumstance to connect to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And the word discipline means, it comes from a root word etymologically that means a learner. Discipline is a willful exercise conforming oneself to a higher authority. And admitting that there is a higher authority than oneself, and then accepting the direction of that higher authority, and conforming one's activities, the way one uses one's senses around that authority. That discipline, according to the Bhakti scripture, says that one will become a learner. One will develop a higher level of discipline. And that will open one to great possibilities. In fact, just by using the human senses that we've been given in discipline that is directed by the Shastra, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, take the Shastra. What the Shastra says, follow that. It's perfect. And if you follow the direction, then you'll have great success. And if you don't, he says, Ye shastra virim utstrija vartate kama karata. Na sasidim avapnoti na sukam na param gatim. If you don't follow Shastra and don't discipline yourself around this principle, then you won't attain happiness, you won't attain perfection, you won't attain the supreme goal. You're not going anywhere, except for within the confines of the material world. And it will be beyond your control anyway, where you go, unless you attach yourself to following the direction of the Shastra. So this is discipline, and there's a higher, and by the practice of yoga, by associating with the scripture in a certain way, following its direction, one reaches higher and higher levels of discipline, which give one more and more opportunity. Nayam deho deha bhajan riloke kashtan kamam arhate vidbujam ye tapo divyam putrake yena sadvam shudyed yasmad brahma saukyam tonantam. Rishabhadev told his sons that by disciplining yourself around this principle of following the Shastra. It means tapodivyam, you're taking the divine authority and you're accepting some kind of inconvenience based on that, then you will attain purification and you also attain unlimited happiness. On the other hand, one will automatically have to accept inconvenience in this world because it will come unsought. So it's better to preemptively accept inconvenience for the sake of improving oneself spiritually. And this is wise to voluntarily take these inconveniences. And the way yajna works is there's a plan that Krishna has given and a system for discipline in this world. And if I accept that plan and I take the inconvenience on behalf of Krishna, Jagnartat karmano nyatra loko yam karma bandhana. Next part. That if you accept this is called yajna, to satisfy Krishna, if you do discipline in that way, then you'll have everything you need in this life, and then you'll go back home, back to God in the next life. And by that process of discipline, you'll also learn the difference between yourself and the external material body, and then you'll become wise. And contentment means content. It comes from the word contain. And being content indicates that I'm holding certain things. I'm a vessel. My heart is a vessel, my mind is a vessel. I can capture things from my environment and hold them in. Some people capture all kinds of odds and ends from the material world, and they hold within themselves various qualities like jealousy and anger, and what else? Lust, envy. These can be accumulated and held within oneself, and in such a condition, if one's holding these things, if one becomes a container for these things, then one becomes discontent. However, if I very carefully use my human body, including the mind, to capture the divine sounds which are coming from a higher stratum, from the spiritual world, and I become a vessel for those, then I become what we call content, because I contain something that is naturally at a higher vibration. And so the practice of yoga means to accept various means of living so that one will develop a higher level of perception, discipline, and contentment. Perception means what you take in from your environment based on the way you're predisposed, because we don't see the world the way it is, we see the world the way we are. What I'm predisposed to see, I will see in every circumstances. Satyadev Prabhu used to remind me of that all the time. Man sees what he wants us to see. Right, Satya? And then discipline, which means to become a learner, it means you voluntarily accept a higher authority, but you accept tapodivyam, divine authority, and shastra, which comes from God, and you follow that rather than following the dictates of your senses. And here it comes. Kamadinam katina katita palita durnideshas tesham jata mayinat karunana trapano pashanti utsrijayatana tayarupate samprata labda buddhis tamayata sharanam abhayam mamnyungshvat madasye. Rather than following the bad masters of the senses and lust, anger, greed, and so forth, one purposefully follows a higher authority. And even ritual means to conform one's activity around a higher authority. This is the proper meaning of ritual, that I accept a certain set of activities that I do every day. Ritual is not bad. It just needs to be conscious. I need to be conscious that while I'm performing it, I'm conforming my activities. It's a discipline, conforming myself to a higher authority. who's prescribed such daily activities that I repeat, and they become purifying, and I become a learner. I learn everything, and I get everything necessary by that kind of conforming to that higher authority. Vasudeve Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Prayojita Janyat Yashuvairagyam Jnanam Chayara Haitukam. Especially when it's under the direction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, I'm following the direction of Krishna, then I get causeless knowledge and detachment from the world. And then finally, contentment. That I am a container, and I go around collecting things and putting them in my heart. And so one has to very carefully discern what should be picked up and kept, and what things should be taken out. So to that end, in the yoga process described in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the eightfold process of yoga called Ashtanga, which is mentioned in the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, begins with yam. First there's yam, then there's niyam. So yam means how I interact with the outside world and my relationships with other people and the way I conduct myself. And in the process of yam, the acharyas agree, including Srila Vyasadeva, that the overarching and most important aspect of yam, how I conduct myself in this world, is ahimsa, non-violence. So him means to hurt, to commit violence to other people, and ahimsa means obviously the opposite, to avoid violence. So it is imperative that one become non-violent in one's life in order to advance in the process of yoga and to have a clear mind and consciousness through which one can fix one's mind on Krishna. As Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Man mana bhava mad bhakto, you should think of me always. But if one commits violence, then one will constantly be disturbed oneself because of the reactions that come to those who are violent. So, because this is such an important concept and we hear about ahimsa, I'm going to read a few excerpts from Srila Prabhupada's writings about ahimsa. And then we can have a discussion about it. And by discussing it and hearing what ahimsa really means, and also the really helpful definitions of nonviolence that Srila Prabhupada gives, which are very proactive compared to many people, that we'll be able to help ourselves advance in the process of devotional service. Is that an okay plan? Then here we go. This is from the Bhagavad Gita, 2nd chapter, 3rd verse. And in this verse, Krishna says to Arjuna, who's a warrior, O son of Pritha, do not yield to this degrading impotence. It does not become you. Give up such petty weakness of heart and arise, O chastiser of the enemy. So that doesn't sound very nonviolent, does it? Here's Krishna, the main arbiter of yoga, and he's telling Arjuna to fight. So first of all, we want to look at and see this interesting nuance on violence. How is it that Krishna is telling Arjuna that he has to fight? And as Jayadvaita Maharaj once pointed out in a class, that a violent priest and a nonviolent policeman are never wanted. There used to be a bumper sticker that said, "If you're ever in trouble, if you're in trouble, call a hippie and see if you get any help." So it was kind of from the conservative side. So this policeman has a duty to defend others by using violence, and therefore there may be a way in which violence has a definition according to the circumstance and somebody's duty. And in the purport, this is an excerpt, Prabhupada says, Arjuna might argue that he would give up the battle on the grounds of his magnanimous attitude, for the most respectable Bhishma and his relatives. But Krishna considered that sort of magnanimity mere weakness of heart. Such false magnanimity was not approved by any authority. Therefore, such magnanimity, or so-called non-violence, should be given up by persons like Arjuna under the direct guidance of Krishna. So this is an interesting case that Arjuna wants to claim that I'm going to be non-violent, and therefore I won't go into the battle, and now it's being condemned. And Krishna is saying, no, you have to fight. Do you find it interesting? So this is something that oftentimes we must explain when we're presenting Bhagavad Gita, because people sometimes look at the Bhagavad Gita and they say, and we've heard this many times, that you're talking about spirituality, but this is on a battlefield. How can you support this? How is that spiritual? How is it not? How is it ahimsa or non-violence to distribute a book that advocates war? Can you all support that? Yes? Yes? Okay, let's hear you. We'll take a few arguments from your understanding.
So as Krishna is telling him that Klabyam Masma Gamapartha, so he's telling him that he is, this impotence that is coming from him is coming from the weakness of his heart. So because he's thinking about himself, and that's the reason that he's not willing to fight, because he says that I want to enjoy my kingdom, but how will I enjoy it when my near and dear ones are all gone? And in that line, he's neglecting to do his duty. He's a Kshatriya and a king, so his first duty is to take care of the kingdom and take care of the citizens. And also, if he doesn't do that, then the evil will prevail, and that will do more damage. As Arjuna was also advocating at some point in the Bhagavad Gita, in the first chapter, where he was saying that when the good people, when the elderly die, then the traditions will be lost, and then bad unwanted progeny will come and things like that. So same thing will also happen if you don't take to task. Like as Jayadutta Swami Maharaj says that a gentle policeman, nobody likes that. So same applies in this case as well. So it's a justified violence.
Okay.
In that case.
Thank you. That was good. Vittal?
In one of Prabhupada's lecture, I heard Prabhupada defining violence as denying someone his right. So I thought it was a very interesting definition, and it just struck to me when you said, how will you convince someone about this book? So I was thinking that our right is to actually go back to Krishna and be enjoyed by him, and this book talks about that ultimate goal. So in that
what
way,
also about in the context of the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata?
Sorry, bro?
Isn't it also true that the Pandavas were being denied of their right to have the kingdom, and that Duryodhana and Dhritarashtra were unlawfully taking something away from them? And that needed to be protected also, right? Okay. One more? Yes, Gandharvika.
It's on the battlefield, and it's very, very relevant, especially for today and especially for software engineers, because so many issues, you're in battlefield constantly, and you don't want some theoretical explanation of sitting in a place and letting you know what to do, because there is constant battle going on in our minds too, same as what is explained in this book. So it's very relevant, because in this emergency situation, how do I decide what to do and what not to do? So this book symbolizes what we are going through at every moment, and it gives us guidance at every moment. So that's another.
Okay. Yes, Shamalangi.
I'm not remembering all but there was some 5 kind of aggressors described in the first chapters, one of the purports. So the Kauravas, fall under that category. And also I was thinking that following the instructions of the Lord is even on a higher platform than non-violence. So.
Okay, good. And that's what's mentioned here also, that such false magnanimity was not approved by any authority. So one may claim non-violence, but then commit violence. For instance, Prabhupada used to bring up this point, if someone attacks, based on this Manu Samhita, that there are different kinds of aggressors, he would ask, if someone attacks your wife or your child, would you use violence to protect them? And if you say no, then you're at fault, because you have a duty to do, to protect those who are dependent on you, and in that case, that is not the kind of ahimsa which is prohibited. Yes?
So then, if people say that anything can be accomplished by true love, how do we understand that in relation to the false magnanimity? Because they say that love is the most powerful thing in the world, and everything can be accomplished through that. So there is no non-violence in the type of love that people talk about. So how do we say that the non-violence of where you should punish the aggressors? Are you really changing the core of the heart, the tendency to commit sin, because you're executing your duty, even though it's non-violent, but because it's said in the Shastras that you have to do this because he's an aggressor? So how do we say that?
Well, there's Shastra and there's Shastra. And both come from the same root word. And the Shastra means one voluntarily accepts the higher authority which directs one. And Shastra means if you don't follow that, then you have to be convinced otherwise by use like a weapon or a stick. And ultimately both are merciful, because if someone comes into town and gets drunk and starts acting unruly and disturbing the peace or worse, then the policeman will come and lock him up for the night. And someone may say, well, the policeman's being violent, or he's not being loving, or something like that. But actually, he's detaining the person from breaking the law and also harming others, and also therefore harming himself. So there's an overarching kind of love, in the sense that in disciplining those who are not able to follow the Shastra in a way that they can restrain themselves for some time till they can sober up and then come back out and act like decent citizens. Kanka.
Sometimes we have to see what is love. Just like you were talking about, like let's say a parent, he might have to discipline the child and put the child in his room, or even, spank the child if the child runs out in front of a car. And so it may appear like violence, but actually it's love. So what is love? That's the, I think the key understanding of, and Krishna, at the beginning, he actually tried to stop the battle of Kurukshetra himself. He went there, but he saw how unruly Duryodhana was and how demoniac, and that this was not going to, even though he went himself to stop it, it wasn't going to stop.
Thank you. That was very helpful. And we're going to move on to the next point, because we have a lot to cover. However, just after our last point, somebody please write a sutra. Think about it and write a sutra to encapsulate what we've just learned from this first principle. Kedarnath, want to make a point? Of course, we insist upon it.
Actually, definition of violent little bit not that straightforward, because everyone in material world actually is violent, because every step, every breath, we are killing. Everyone is killing. So basically, not being in Krishna consciousness, it's violent.
No being,
not being a Krishna consciousness.
not being Krishna.
It's violent itself because you have to kill every step, every breath, like driving a car, driving bicycle. We're killing many species.
We're getting to that. We're going to get to that point.
So, and one of the points of Srila Prabhupada and Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam saying, violence it means it's doom others to actually continue take other body.
Yeah. This is a good point. And it gives a preview of there's several angles here, and this is one of the main ones that's very, very well taken. Gandharvika and Malini, you write a sutra to define what the first point was. Sutra means as few words as possible with maximum import. Okay, so here's a quote from the Bhagavad Gita 3:35. It is far better to discharge one's prescribed duties even though faultily than another's duties perfectly. Destruction in the course of performing one's own duty is better than engaging in another's duties, for to follow another's path is dangerous. An excerpt from the purport. When one is under the spell of the modes of material nature, one should follow the prescribed rules for his particular situation and should not imitate others. For example, a brahmana who is in the mode of goodness is non-violent, whereas a kshatriya who is in the mode of passion is allowed to be violent. As such, for a kshatriya, it is better to be vanquished following the rules of violence than to imitate a brahmana who follows the principles of non-violence. This goes to the Jayadvaita Maharaj's point of a violent priest or a non-violent policeman is never wanted. Moving to the next point, Bhagavad Gita 4:7. From the Bhagavatam, we understand that Lord Buddha is the incarnation of Krishna who appeared when materialism was rampant and materialists were using the pretext of the authority of the Vedas. Although there are certain restrictive rules and regulations regarding animal sacrifice for particular purposes in the Vedas, people of demonic tendency still took to animal sacrifice without reference to the Vedic principles. Lord Buddha appeared to stop this nonsense and to establish the Vedic principles of nonviolence. So it mentioned that even in the context of following the Shastra, there are historical accounts of how people would misuse that license for some kind of a killing or violence, and then there's mission creep, and then people start using it wantonly without the actual direction of the Shastra, but they use this as to justify certain kinds of activities. So the tendency towards violence is so strong in the material world, one has to be careful not to misuse this idea that we just talked about, that one has a certain duty, one may have a certain duty to perform in which violence is used to protect others or for some sort of Vedic sacrifice. But one has to watch out that it doesn't become a justification for one's own purpose to commit violence, one's own idea to commit violence. The next quotation is from the Bhagavad Gita 10:4, and this is from the purport. Ahimsa, non-violence, means that one should not do anything which will put others into misery or confusion. Ahimsa, non-violence, means that one should not do anything which will put others into misery or confusion. Material activities that are promised by so many politicians, sociologists, philanthropists, etc., do not produce very good results because the politicians and philanthropists have no transcendental vision. They do not know what is actually beneficial for human society. Ahimsa means that people should be trained in such a way that the full utilization of the human body can be achieved. The human body is meant for spiritual realization, so any movement or any commissions which do not further that end commit violence on the human body. That which furthers the future spiritual happiness of the people in general, that which furthers the future spiritual happiness of the people in general is called nonviolence. So here's even a more proactive definition of nonviolence that Kedarnath Prabhu was pointing out, that there is a way in which people have tendencies to do whatever they want to do based on their sense desires and the urges of the mind. And one who has a clear idea about what is the ultimate goal of life and how to attain it commits violence if he doesn't help others to come to that position, to make a progressive march in spiritual life. So now we'll just talk about that a little bit, because it's a very interesting definition of nonviolence, or violence, that is to just let people go their own way and not actually help them. And sometimes people don't like it. Prabhupada mentions that man's on the roof and he's about to back off, and somebody warns him, hey, you're about to fall off the roof. And he says, leave me alone, stop don't harass me. And so when someone's given good instruction for their own good so they don't hurt themselves, sometimes they also complain. Any comments about this principle? Yes. Damodar Vamsidhari Prabhu.
I think one of the contexts is in the initial days of Srila Prabhupada, when the movement was just in a very nascent stage, and one of your senior godbrothers that time, so Srila Prabhupada and the class was going on, and that devotee started talking about the why impersonal aspect is better than the personal aspect. And Srila Prabhupada, though he was in the risk of losing those handful of devotees, Srila Prabhupada's face turned red with anger, and Prabhupada asked, are you done? And he kept on going. Then Srila Prabhupada asked again, are you done? He kept on going, and then Srila Prabhupada put his fist onto the table and said, why don't you understand? And he was in a very big fit of rage. And he said that you have spent so much time with me and still you don't understand that Krishna is a person, not an impersonal thing. And in one of when the incident was described, people who are less mature may think that Srila Prabhupada was violent or doing ahimsa. But in the core context of if we see this principle, then Srila Prabhupada actually wanted benefit of those who were there with him to guide onto the right path of Srila Prabhupada telling that Krishna is a person and it's not the impersonal, which was rampant with all the other yoga teachers which were around in the West that time. So that was an example of ahimsa, but with strong words.
Thank you. That's a nice anecdote. I had a nice shloka. In fact, I had a bunch of shlokas that I accidentally left on the airplane. I always thought it would be interesting, the person who picks them up and looks at all these different shlokas. On my flight to Washington, D.C., when I arrived, I couldn't find them anywhere. They must have slid under the seat or something. Anyway, one of the shlokas in the pack was a statement by Krishna in the 11th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, where he says that one should not see the faults or criticize, especially other Vaishnavas. And then in the commentary, there's a mention that the Acharyas say that a Vaishnav may point out the faults in other Vaishnavas if those Vaishnavas have been affected by wrong philosophy and are perpetrating it and therefore harming others by perpetrating the philosophy. And in which case it's the duty of a person to point out the fault and even to make criticism of the arguments that they're making. Of course, there's always a way, as Prabhupada brought up to the devotees when they first went to India, and oftentimes they were assailed by people asking them, what do you think of this Swami, what do you think of that Guru, and so forth. And Prabhupada instructed them that they should ask the person, rather than talk about the person and make an ad hominem remark about the individual, say, what is his philosophy? And then assail the philosophy and not the person. And this kind of goes into the category of nonviolent communication, doesn't it, Satyadev Prabhu? The way in which we deal with criticism, or the way in which when we're teaching Krishna consciousness, there may be we may have a duty to point out a particular fault in the philosophy, but how we do it is also important. Hare Krishna Dayanidhi Prabhu. Hare Krishna. Is everyone okay? Is the temperature all right? Is it too hot or too cold? Okay, could we have 1 degree lower, please? Is it too warm? Just, it is? 1 degree lower, please. Thank you. Did I make my last point? No. Okay. Pardon me? There's a way in which, even if we're offering some criticism, and this may, somebody might say, oh, a spiritual person shouldn't offer an argument. Damodar brought this up, that Prabhupada became angry at a certain point, asserted himself in a very, he asserted himself. And because of that, sometimes someone who misunderstands that might say, oh, why are you becoming angry, or why are you asserting yourself? But there's a way in which, when teaching somebody a principle that is for their improvement, and not only that, if there's an assembly and a point needs to be made, if someone asserts themselves, then this is not considered violence. However, I'm making the point that Prabhupada also brought out the subtlety that don't attack the person, but attack the philosophy. Rather than making an ad hominem attack on the person, saying, well, you're just no good, to talk about what's wrong with the philosophy and why it's not correct. And in that way, one avoids the fault of the ad hominem attack. Because that will result in a tit-for-tat kind of exchange, where then they just criticize you for your character and so forth, rather than based on the philosophy. Satyadev, any points so far? You give him the microphone. He's getting his glasses out. No, not yet, but it will be in a second. Okay, go ahead. Press the button and then technical support, please.
Yeah, I mean, Krishna, and he talks about nonviolent communication in the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 17, in verse 15, where he explains the principles, the essence of nonviolent communication. Or to communicate means that you say something and the person actually hears you, right, and understands what you're saying. Otherwise, you haven't really communicated anything because they haven't received anything. So in order to do that, one has to approach a person in such a way that their heart and their ears remain open as you're speaking to them. So if you're criticizing the person or attacking the person, their character or their sense of being or their value, then immediately the person's going to go into a defensive mode. and then doesn't hear what you want to say. So Krishna says your speech should be pleasing, it should be truthful, it should be not disturbing. So there's a way, like you're giving the example, where if you talk about the philosophy as opposed to the person, then you're not attacking that person's character. And the people around who are listening aren't going to rise up in support of that person. They're going to be listening to the real bone of contention you have, which is they're teaching something maybe that's not true. But I just wanted to say, in general, I think ahimsa is a law of the universe. And before we can actually be violent towards someone through our mind or through our words or through our actions, the defilement first has to come within our own heart.
The what does?
The defilement.
Oh, I see.
We have to defile ourselves. We have to hold violence within ourselves towards someone before we actually speak or act. So already the reaction, the ignorance, we're already dipping ourselves into ignorance, you could say, or keeping ourselves. We're actually being violent towards ourselves before we can be violent towards anybody else. And so there's already a reaction there. So ahimsa is really just, it's a spiritual law. And then you can get into all the different ideas and ways that may play out. But if we're holding, ill will towards someone, then that's offensive. And there's a price to pay for that.
Thank you very much. How are you doing on the sutra? Let's hear what you got so far.
So this is until what we read last time, Prabhuji. Following the right authority is true non-violence. That's the first sutra. And the second sutra is true perception of non-violence is to be disciplined to follow the Shastras and feel truly content through spiritual progress.
Can you give an example of how following the right authority is nonviolence that shows, that like illustrates it?
I think Arjuna and Krishna itself that we discussed is one example. And
how is it an example?
Because Arjuna wanted to run away from the situation, but he followed the authority of Krishna because he came to the senses of what is good and what is bad. Otherwise, he could have committed violence at a larger scale if he had not killed the aggressors. So that is following the authority. That's one thing.
Shamalangi wants to get in on this.
Because you were asking about example, I was thinking a soldier who fights under the command of a senior officer or the government. Even if he kills, that is not considered violence. Whereas if a general person goes and done, it's different.
Why isn't it considered?
Because he's doing it under the instructions of the authority, who is the...
And why does that make it nonviolent? Because?
The authority takes the responsibility.
Well, then why isn't the authority violent in that case then? Why does it make it any better? Vittal, support the point?
No, I don't have it. I was thinking the authority is acting for a higher goal, whereas a person, like just that example, the soldier killing somebody, the authority knows that if he kills somebody...
Okay, it's a good track. A higher goal means you understand, you can see more what the consequences are going to be. Prabhupada gives the example of their two children. This was a real life example from his neighborhood. There was a young boy who had cholera, and he was prescribed by the doctor not to eat anything, otherwise it could result in his becoming worse and actually dying. And so the parents had said, don't feed him anything. But the younger brother, came to see his brother in his room, and the brother who had cholera said, I'm really, really hungry. Can't you give me at least something? And so then the younger brother considered it violence that his parents had prescribed not to eat anything. So why shouldn't I feed him? So he transgressed their law, the higher law, and he went and he brought him a little bit of cake. And Prabhupada had mentioned that he came by and saw that that younger boy was being punished. And then, of course, in the neighborhood, everyone told why he was being punished, because he had gone against the instruction of his parents, who had the higher authority of the doctor, saying he shouldn't take anything, otherwise he's going to die from eating it. So someone might say, the parents are committing violence by punishing they were committing violence, the parents were committing violence by not allowing the boy to take the food. The doctor was making violence because he's prescribed he can't eat. But no, they have a higher vision of what the goal and the destination is. So this principle of following Shastra, following what comes down from the higher authority, means that although inevitably there's violence in the material world, one acts in such a way that one minimizes the violence, and also one commits only necessary violence, which is meant for the improvement of those involved in the particular situation. Did you finish your sutras? Let's give them a hand. Sutras are not... Okay. Then we have 13.8. Prabhupada writes, nonviolence is generally taken to mean not killing or destroying the body, but actually nonviolence means not to put others into distress. People in general are trapped by ignorance in the material concept of life, and they perpetually suffer material pains. So unless one elevates people to spiritual knowledge, one is practicing violence. I repeat. So unless one elevates people to spiritual knowledge, one is practicing violence. And as Satyadev Prabhu pointed out, violence begins at home. So if one also doesn't adhere to the practice of spiritual life and neglects one's spiritual life, one's committing violence to oneself. And then one might also suggest such a path of life to others. Prabhupada pointed out that oftentimes young people would come to Krishna consciousness, and then their parents would complain. And they'd say, why are you doing that? Why don't you do like I did? And then Prabhupada would point out that that person was miserable their whole life, working the way they worked, and ended up in a not so good situation. And then when the child wanted to take to Krishna consciousness, the parent would say, why don't you do like me, instead of why do that? Or even extreme cases we saw in America where the parents, and there was even I saw a cartoon about this, the parents, when the person had left Krishna consciousness and come home, he said, I'm so happy you're back being a drug-addicted hippie and you've given up that practice of spiritual life. Because one doesn't understand the goal of life or can't appreciate it for others. So unless one elevates people to spiritual knowledge, one is practicing violence. So this is a very, as I keep using the word, proactive vision of nonviolence. If you have the cure to a disease, as an example, if there was an epidemic in the city of Mountain View and people were dying, and you knew that you had the cure, and then you sat on it because, well, the price is going to go up. We'll wait until next month and then we can sell this for more, or you're just lazy, or for any other reason, you didn't make sure that the cure was distributed to the people, to the masses, that would be a kind of violence. I think we discussed in a previous class some years ago about also if you're at the scene of a crime, and we need a Kurnoth for this because he knew the current laws, and somebody's being harmed or injured, and you just leave them there. So, you know anything about these laws from your time as a paramedic? That if you don't take care of somebody who's actually hurt?
I think, well, I don't know it from that angle, but if you do want to help them and you're not a professional, if you do your best to help them, you won't be responsible if you injure them.
That's interesting. A Good Samaritan law.
Good Samaritan Act, yeah.
How you all in the front row? We have, everyone knows up here all the laws.
But as far as I know, you don't have a duty to save them.
Okay.
Except the medical people are mandated to stop and help if they are professional.
Like if you're in an airplane and they say there's a doctor on board, and you're a doctor, but you say like, I got to finish my drink, and the guy's dying of a heart attack or choking on something, then that's violence, right? And it's also unlawful because you have higher knowledge, you have a higher you have the ability, you have higher knowledge, and you don't utilize it. That's violence. So Prabhupada is extending it to those who understand that Bhagavad Gita is a panacea, as Harivamsha Prabhu put it today at Google. He was in our class at Google today. He was pointing out this proactive kind of definition that if you don't administer it, then that's also, you're at fault. Yes, Shraddha.
I just wanted to share that when we do book distribution, how much of non-violence act we are doing, because we go door to door to bring people to that knowledge and not just let them be what they are. And I was also contrasting that with the term that we use, weekend warriors. And so it seems like a violent term.
Weekend warriors,
yeah,
right.
Yeah, but we are
for
actually warriors.
A non-violent cause, the most non-violent cause. Yes.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaj.
Who is that? Go ahead.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaj. Varsana Devi Dasi, Dandat Pranam.
Hare Krishna, Varshana. Please go ahead.
Guru Maharaj, sometimes, mainly I have seen in India, that a patient is sick and the doctor, he keeps on giving, telling them to go for various tests when the person is sick. And it is just to make money and, you see, because they get commission on that particular test. So that is why they keep on prescribing this way. So is this, my understanding is correct, this is also a violence against the...
Yeah, of course. If the motive is not correct, if one has a profit motive and therefore exploits people and doesn't give the cure or withholds a cure. I mentioned that also earlier. If, you hold on to the cure because the price is going to go up later, or you can't get enough profit from it or something like that, this can be considered a kind of violence. Improper motive, yes. Prabhuji.
And there was another person, one doctor, who said, Guru Maharaj, that this body is a temple, and the doctors, it is the doctor's duty to take care of it. So is that also correct?
Yeah, we were just talking about that earlier, that a medical practitioner who has knowledge of how to help somebody and they don't do it, or they withhold treatment so they can extract more money or something like that, that's also violence. Malini, were you going to make a point?
Yes, Prabhuji.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you very much. Very helpful.
Prabhuji, on the contrast, when we go door to door, somebody tells what's use of you distributing so many books when people are actually dying of hunger. And many times this actually comes up. And this point what Srila Prabhupada was making is that unless one is elevated to spiritual knowledge, actually one is practicing violence, because you may feed them today, tomorrow, or day after, but once you stop feeding them, then again they'll seek to violence and try to grab food from somebody else. But when you give them a book, they might come to a point where they can actually realize what is real non-violence. So we used to use that point many times to describe.
And did it help?
Depends on the person. Some people accept, and some people, as Satyadev Prabhu was saying, they are not ready to listen to what we are saying. But for some people, it does help.
Okay. Yes, Prabhu.
Prabhuji,
Nice.
I just want to emphasize on this. Especially corporate worlds today, the people like software consultants have seen working 16 hours a day. And in our office today, one of the person was working a lot past 1 week. He was in stress, and 911 came because of the people came, took her in the ambulance to the doctor. So it's basically, as you said, if you put some other people in distress, that means even the corporate people, the corporate world today is doing that, right? I'm thinking like that. So maybe the best way is to give this more distribution of Bhagavad Gita to corporate world so that they'll come to an understanding. Not necessarily 8 hours, not 16 hours, 8 hours is enough. I'm just thinking about it.
Yeah, it's a cruel world. I mean, there is a way in which people are being worked to death and so forth. So anyway, more books in the corporate. We'll take that. Who else had a point? Yes. Hari Vamsha.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji. So I was just meditating on what Varshana Mataji told about doctors. Just thinking what actually is the meditation of a real compassionate doctor. Because I would remember my father would put a small prayer in his cabin, which read as that it is the dilemma of the situation that my earning is based on curing your disease. But I pray that I will be at the service. So I was just thinking that in the whole culture of genuine devotees and right authorities, since they are connected with the scriptures and Krishna, they are suhrids. I mean, they just think about, just well-wishing for everybody. So whatever they'll do, it will be naturally progressive towards Krishna. So
what about the case of somebody who is a so-called spiritual doctor, but then has some motivation and is using that position to manipulate others and not actually to cure them spiritually?
then we triangulate from Guru Sadhu Shastra and come to...
But is that violence also? So I'm just saying the possibility from point of view of somebody who, as I'll just say that in the Shri Ishopanishad, it says, Anyareva hor vidya ya anyara hora vidya iti shushumadhiranam yenas tadvichakshire. What's the verse before that? No, about vidyam. In other words, it says that the nescience is bad, but false knowledge is worse. Because if you pose yourself as a spiritual doctor, or for instance, if someone as a medical doctor puts up a fake diploma and starts shooting people up with, Kool-Aid and, saying, here, this is a cure to polio or something like that, that's especially egregious. And similarly, if somebody claims to be a spiritual doctor, but then is actually giving misinformation and is not properly following themselves, then this is also the Sri Ishopanishad. What is the verse? Andan tama pravishanti ye vidyam upasite tato bhuya ivate tamo ya'u vidyayam rataha. That nescience is bad. That's why we're in the mess we're in. But false knowledge, perpetrating fake knowledge is worse. And probably gives the example of a cobra with a diamond on its head. You may think, beautiful diamond, and then you get bit. So that's also based on one has to be properly motivated and also properly aligned and authorized to present as one's, in order to be considered a proper savior and, doing the right thing in the spiritual circle. Okay, I have a little more to read. And I didn't finish this sentence. One should try his best to distribute real knowledge to the people so that they may become enlightened and leave this material entanglement. That is nonviolence. Again, One should try his best to distribute real knowledge to the people so that they may become enlightened and leave this material entanglement. That is non-violence. So that's a very satisfying, because that's something we can do something about, to organize ourselves to take the cure and also give it to others as much as possible. And the next quote comes from the Bhagavad Gita 16:1. From the purport, ahimsa means not arresting the progressive life of any living entity. One should not think that since the spirit spark is never killed, even after the killing of the body, there is no harm in killing animals for sense gratification. People are now addicted to eating animals in spite of having an ample supply of grains, fruits, and milk. There is no necessity for animal killing. This injunction is for everyone. When there is no alternative, one may kill an animal, but it should be offered in sacrifice. At any rate, when there is an ample food supply for humanity, persons who are desiring to make advancement in spiritual realization should not commit violence to animals. Real ahimsa means not checking anyone's progressive life. The animals are also making progress in their evolutionary life by transmigrating from one category of animal life to another. If a particular animal is killed, then his progress is checked. If an animal is staying in a particular body for so many days or so many years and is untimely killed, then he has to come back again in that form of life to complete the remaining days in order to be promoted to another species of life. So their progress should not be checked simply to satisfy one's palate. This is called ahimsa. And Prabhupada mentions in his purports that one should not kill trees unnecessarily. And he rails on those who cut down trees methodically in order to print literature which is inconsequential in helping people advance spiritually, just for sense gratification and so forth. Killing trees is sinful. So that means any living entity that is harmed for one's own sense gratification, that becomes a violent situation. So Kedarnath Prabhu pointed out that one should therefore conduct one's activities based on yajna. And in the Shastra it is said that there's a way in which every householder commits violence, and therefore they must perform the pancha yajna. Prabhupada mentions this in the Bhagavad Gita. There are 5-fold sacrifices that one must perform every day. And that is because by nature of our very lives, as the Bhagavatam says, hastani sahastanam aparani chatu, I better be careful, chatuspadam, falgani tatra mahatam jivo jivasya jivanam, just as I'm speaking. That by nature, one living being is food for another. And then also, the Shastra says that by breathing, we kill living entities. By cooking, when we put on the heat. By drinking water, living entities are killed. By grinding spices, we kill living entities. Did I say lighting fire? By cooking. And by walking. There are these 5 ways in which... he's testing me. That there's these 5 ways in which we constantly commit sin by killing living entities. And therefore, the Shastra says one should live one's life connected to yajna all the time. So that's why it's dangerous not to act outside the life that's directed by Scripture and by conducting one's life for Shastra. In the case of somebody who is engaged in yajna, for instance, if you're cooking for Krishna and not for yourself, this is a kind of yajna. And if there's incidental killing of living entities by lighting the fire, then Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Sarva dharman parityaja mamekam sharanam braja aham tvang sarva papebhyo mokshayishami masucha. Because you're living a surrendered life to me, you're not held accountable for these sins. Also, Devarshi Bhutapna Nirnam Pitranam Naking Karonayam Rani Charajan Sarvatmaraya Sharanam Sharanyam Gato Mukundam Parihrita Kartam. The kind of debt that we owe to other living entities because of taking whatever they give us, and including that, we basically, as children, we suck the life out of our parents by taking their whole attention. Not you, Gita. That we're not responsible for the reactions that come to that if one is fully surrendered to Mukunda. So one should live a surrendered life. And I'll finish with the last two very short quotes. Austerity of the body consists in worship of the Supreme Lord, the Brahmanas. This is from 1714. Austerity of the body consists in worship of the Supreme Lord, the Brahmanas, the spiritual master and superiors like the father and mother, and in cleanliness, simplicity, celibacy, and non-violence. And finally, from the Srimad Bhagavatam 1.9.26. The Lord degraded Arjuna at that time to the status of an uncivilized man for his avowed acceptance of the cult of nonviolence. The administrative class must be personally trained in military education. I liked Satyadev Prabhu's reference to the 17th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, in which Krishna gives the austerities of speech. And he says, one should speak truthfully, beneficially, avoiding speech that offends. One should regularly recite the Vedas. And oftentimes, we commit violence by the way we speak. There's envy within the heart of every living entity in the material world, this matsara. And when it comes out, Krishna says in the 11th canto to Uddhava, in talking about the Avanti Brahman, then it acts like a spear that can pierce the heart of another and injure another person. And you can do great violence by the words that you speak. I've done surveys before and seminars about the yoga of the tongue seminar, in the yoga of the tongue seminar, asking, have you ever had someone say something to you that that discouraged you for a long time throughout your life? And practically everybody raised their hand and said, at one time or another during their life, someone said something to them that deeply affected them or discouraged them, and it wounded them. And Krishna says the same, that it can perpetrate a wound on somebody's heart if you speak harsh words out of envy. And this is a kind of violence. So it's very important to control the tongue. And a little sutra I had thought of when I was riding on the plane the other day is, don't press the send button. Because oftentimes I think, like with computers, if someone writes you a caustic note and you're thinking like, why I oughta, and then if you write something, whatever it is, I've noticed this, the consciousness, when the consciousness becomes colored by this kind of reaction that comes from the false ego, that like, how dare he, or, I oughta. And if you write something, the wording just comes out in such a way that a person can tell. And if you press the send button, then it's gone. And it's out there. And not only does it go to the person, but it'll end up on Facebook, and then it's in the Google memory banks forever. And that's it. And nowadays, it's just interesting, because in Kali Yuga it says, you're not responsible for the things you think, just the things you do. But you're really responsible for them, because before you might say something in the village and it may stay in the village and not make it to the city. But nowadays it makes it all the way around the universe and stays in the Akashic record forever, that you said such and such at such and such a time. So don't push the send button. And that means if something comes into your heart and you're thinking, I should say this, don't push the send button. Wait. Because I always notice if I wait a day, and it used to be like that when writing letters, you wait till the next day and go, why did I write? Who wrote that? Oh, I don't hate that guy that much, and besides, it wasn't that bad. And besides, you get more information. It's like, no, he didn't really say that. And if you already sent it, like now you have to explain the whole thing. So the idea from this austerity of speech, it means to don't be reactive. Be careful not think of this principle that what I say will have an effect on the people around me, and it can injure them, and as the consequence, it will also come back and injure me. And therefore, in the process of yoga, the Ashtanga yoga, we start with yam, and the non-violence means if you're violent towards other people, then you can't actually think of God. You can't even look at yourself, because your mind will be so disturbed. So this principle of non-violence should be practiced by following authority, making sure one is properly aligned, and also in restraining oneself from speaking in violent ways, considering the consequences before one does anything, and also proactively by being compassionate to oneself and non-violent towards oneself by regularly taking the medicine of Krishna consciousness and then giving it to other people in a way that is palatable so that they can also improve spiritually. Any last points that you think are important to put into the hat? Manmohini, please. And here comes the microphone. And anybody online you can check into.
Hare Krishna. In a purport in the 7th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, Srila Prabhupada explains regarding insects that the dumb, innocent insects aren't aware of how they bother us, about how they sting us and how they disturb us. But we, as humans, should be aware of how painful death is. So no matter what they do to us, we should be kind to them and not kill them.
What about dengue fever? When I was in Vrindavan
there are probably exceptions.
A couple of years ago, dengue fever was going around, and you get bit by one of those infected mosquitoes, and there were people dying. The cook over at the Sanskrit school, he died within about 5 days from dengue fever.
I heard that Prabhupada said that mosquitoes are aggressors. They're attacking you.
Well, I heard that he said to Tamal Krishna Maharaj, if they become aggressors, then you can consider. But just going around willy-nilly, like even in the case of Parikshit Maharaj's son, after the snake bird killed Maharaj Parikshit, then his son went on a rampage to kill all the snakes in the world, and he had to be restrained. Same with Dhruva Maharaj. He was a Kshatriya, and after his brother was killed by one of the Yakshas, he went on a rampage and wanted to kill all the Yakshas, but then Manu had to come and say, no, hold on, not so far. So there's a balance point at which one has to consider the circumstances. So
we don't support pest control, only when we're being attacked.
Well, maybe. You have to consider the circumstances.
Okay.
And so, yeah. But especially just in the case of mosquitoes, one has to make sure that their habitat isn't there. Better to start on that end. But your point is well taken. There's a way in which I might be envious of living creatures and just thinking like they're insignificant. But we can test ourselves and see that how we feel compassionate towards other living entities. That we don't just think like, what's he doing here? This is my house. Squash him. Prabhupada would escort a bug out of the house or make sure that he wasn't dislodged from his particular occupation. Put him on a leaf, he told Srutakirti, for a little bug, take him outside, make sure he's hungry in here. He's, like that. We should be careful. Mosquitoes are a special case. Yes. But they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. Best to be preventative first.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
On similar lines, I was pondering about the idea where it is not kosher to kill trees in order to print literature. And I love books and I love reading. And more to the point, I feel that there is probably a threshold, as you mentioned, there is always a trade-off or balance where you have to make that judgment call. As an extreme example, it's probably okay to use an old dying tree to print Bhagavad Gita. What guidance do we have in order to help us make such judgment calls in our day-to-day lives?
Well, similar to what you said, I mean, not that I don't know how old trees do as far as paper goes, but the general principle is, and Prabhupada mentions this in the Bhagavatam, first canto, 5th chapter, when he talks about how there are literatures which are meant for crows, or crow-like people, who are just interested in topics of sense gratification, and there are transcendental literatures. And furthermore, in the 4th canto, he talks about this as well, that if one is printing literature for the sake of enlightening people in Krishna consciousness, then this is not violence to the trees. It's necessary to print. But one should be judicious even in that. I mean, how one is a steward of the resources that Krishna gives one and isn't unnecessarily violent towards any living entity, even in the discharge of one's duty in farming or gardening or anything like that. I come across this a lot in the garden. We have a small garden in the backyard, and you know, when you grow things, you have a little competition back there. And also just digging up the earth and so forth. You know, people stick their heads up all the time and say, "Hey, what are you doing? I live down here." And meanwhile, you're trying to grow something. So this is the nature of the material world. Jivo jivasya jivanam. As you're moving about the world, you're going to disrupt the lives of others naturally, just because this is a world of exploitation. Just by our breathing and our very existence here means we're exploiting others. Therefore, one must move for yajna. One must move for the sake of enlightening and helping others in Krishna consciousness and pleasing Krishna. And then those things are not considered, but one should not misuse that either.
Is it fair to say that violence is inevitable, but we should strive to minimize it and direct it, channel it in the right ways, and do yajna to...
That's the sutra. Let's give him a hand. He just nailed it.
Thank you.
Shalabahu, last quick point, because we just have a few minutes for kirtan.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaji.
1 second, Varshana, because Shalabahu has just got the microphone ready to go. Go.
Hare Krishna Maharaj. So, I'm glad we are talking these things, you know, saving these animals and other living beings and trees and everything. I asked this question before, but I have to be very careful that my words doesn't hurt myself or anybody else. And like you said, that send button, very careful, because I was thinking this varnasrama dharma and the discrimination to the other people is also a big violation. That in terms of considering to the Sanatana Dharma, there is a conflict between the Sanatana Dharma and the Varnasrama Dharma, especially for this non-violent engagement to the discrimination and other things.
The discrimination is there naturally because of the effect of the 3 modes of material nature.
That's right.
And to safely accommodate people according to their nature is not violence. People have a certain nature, and to accommodate that nature so that they can peacefully live and therefore prosecute Krishna consciousness is actually non-violence. Whereas to misguide people or not give them proper direction according to their nature, you can see in a society where there's not clear direction of how people are to work or not work and so forth, they get really confused and mixed up and exposed to all kinds of work that is harmful to them. Varshana, hold your question because we have to have kirtan. We'll take it a little bit later.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaji, Dandat Pranam. Guru Maharaji, these days the medications which are being made, they have the capsules, all the capsules have the shells, and those shells are made out of animal skin or animal bones. So that is also violence, and do you think that it should be taken to treat the person?
It's on a case-by-case basis. You have to be very discriminative about what kinds of medicines you take, what kinds of things you eat. The material world is a highly contaminated place, especially in Kali Yuga. We don't live in grass huts. We live in houses made of drywall. Those come from cow bones. You might as well tear your house down. So we should judiciously and carefully as possible navigate our way through this world in such a way that we commit as least violence as possible. What is your name? Ashish. Ashish, you're hired. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Go Premanande, Shri Shri Radha Madan Mohan Ji ki, Shriman Mahaprabhu ki, Shri Shri Lakshmi Nrsingadev ki. Please, let's put away all the asanas and we'll stand up for the arti. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.